Okay, so we left off last time talking about Expressionist and regional modernism, and we'll pick that up and finish it off today, continuing on with Bertrand Goldberg. So Goldberg is a Chicago architect and studied at the Bauhaus, actually. He worked for Mies for a time in Germany, even though he was from Chicago. So here's an example of an American architect going to Europe to study, and obviously he picks up the international style modernism, European modernism, while he is there and brings that back. And he works for a time in the 30s and into the 40s in that genre. But by the 1950s and definitely into the 1960s, he begins to move more into an expressionist mode of modernism, and especially working with concrete and how concrete can be used in a more plastic manner, meaning that it can be formed and molded into various shapes. It doesn't just have to be square and rectangular. And we talked about that with Eero Saarinen, especially with his JFK terminal for TWA. And Goldberg really becomes best known for his work in that. And we see his photo here with a model of that type of structure. And the main example I want to give is his most famous, which is Marina City in Chicago from 1964. And a lot of people know this. Tourists come to town and they look at it and they call them the corncob towers. That's kind of their nickname because they look a little bit like corn cobs on the Illinois prairie. So it's immediately recognizable, and that's a sort of form of expressionist modernism, and that you immediately recognize and are drawn to the form rather than just a simple box. And the curves, first of all, they're circular in plan, which is somewhat unusual, and then the curved balconies that extend for each apartment really gives it a unique form and shape. And it's all very functional in the sense that those curved balconies are, expressing their use as a balcony for the various apartments. But this is also not just architecturally really unique and special. This was the first multi-use project in downtown Chicago, and one of the first in the country in this post-war period. And what I mean by this is that American cities had developed for decades as commercial centers, and people would live outside in neighborhoods outside of the downtown area, but they would commute and go to offices and for shopping in the city center. But this is the first real opportunity in which people are encouraged to move and live in downtown major cities, like Chicago. And so he includes in this project, he includes a shopping mall. There's a river marina for you can park your boat there. There's a bowling alley. There's plenty of parking for the residents because, by this time we're in suburbanization, which we'll be talking about shortly, in which everybody wants to have a car and be able to drive to things. Well, if you're going to live in the downtown city, you have to provide some parking for that. So the lower portion, let me get my clicker here, the lower portion of the towers are the parking decks, which are fully expressed. They're not covered, they're not closed off with some fancy covering so you can't see the cars. You can make them out even here. You can see the back ends of the cars as they're parked there. And there's some movie, I forget the name of it, that's famous, where there's a car chase that goes up the ramp and one of the cars goes flying off and into the Chicago River, and it's a kind of a cool iconic scene. And down in the base is where the shopping plaza is, and you can see a little bit of this and a little office tower to the side. So it's a multi-use center, and this is a radical new approach, which is pretty common in cities today, but in 1964 was a huge experiment and a huge risk for the development team. So here's a historic view with I think that's either the festival hall or the the bowling alley. There's the House of Blues is in one of these facilities now. You can see the bottom portion here of the parking deck. You can see the rear ends of the cars. And there's, what's kind of neat about this is they just put cable railings along the perimeter so that it looks almost open. You can barely see the cable in these, and it looks like you could just, drive your car right off the edge, which has happened a few times. If you throw it in reverse too hard, you'll go right through the cable railing, and there's been one or two cars that have fallen into the river or the dock below. The apartments, this is a view from one of the curved balconies. And so every apartment gets an outdoor living space. It's actually pretty generous, which is nice if you're living in a small apartment in the city. And you get great views. This is actually of the IBM building right next door, which is the big black monolith. Hopefully you recognize that as at least Miesian. And in fact, this is a Mies project itself. Was one of the last projects that Mies did while he was still alive. But you could see almost the difference, right, between the Miesian approach to international style modernism and the, Bertram Goldberg expressionist view of how modern architecture can be. And some more of the views of the city. It's a great location, well sited, on the curve of the river, so you get good views out towards the lake if you happen to be on that end. And just a couple of views of the interior. It's a little unusual because it is a round building. The apartments are pie-shaped, and which is in some ways nice if you're standing inside. The room literally opens up more and more, gets wider and wider until you get to this wall of windows, which looks out onto your balcony, which looks out onto your view. So that works pretty well, but it is hard to get a straight line in your apartment. I've been in several already, and some of you may have had an opportunity to go in one of the apartments, and if you haven't, and you do get a chance, do it. It's really a neat experience to go in there. Here's the view of the kitchen. So this is looking back towards the inside, and you can see the pie shape gets narrower, and you get down to almost the point, and it's a little tight there. But some of the units have been opened up. They take a couple of units and you make a much bigger space, and it works pretty well. But when you have one little wedge of pie, it's not so good. So another architect I want to talk about that definitely worked in this region or in this expressionist form and also somewhat regional is Louis Kahn. So Kahn was originally from Estonia, which is on the Baltic Sea. It was part of the Russian Empire when he was born. It's an independent country now. But when he was young, his family immigrated to the US and they settled in Philadelphia, where he eventually established his practice. And he, like Goldberg, like Saarinen, he had originally worked in a more traditional international Miesian style, Corbusian style of modernism. But he had done a lot of travel and tour in Europe, and he was very much enthralled with the ruins of medieval fortifications and the ancient architecture of Rome and so forth. And he wasn't going to copy that. He's a modernist, so we're not going to recreate flying buttresses and ionic columns and so forth. But he was inspired by their monumentality and their physicality and massing and so forth, and he wanted to recreate a little bit of the effect that those ancient builders created in a modern architecture. And at the bottom is the quote. I won't go through the whole thing. He's famous for having this conversation with a brick. And what does a brick want to be? And this is in a way a very modernist approach to architecture, what is the nature of material and what is its benefits or its strength, almost literally in strength and compression or tension and so forth, and then using that material in an honest manner. And that's really what this whole conversation with a brick is expressing. So perhaps one of his most famous works is the Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. This is along the coastline in Southern California. So right away, you know, it's this beautiful site. It's got incredible weather and all that. So this is from 1966, and this is the iconic view of that, standing in the courtyard of the Institute looking out towards the Pacific Ocean. And so what Kahn does here, this is a facility for scientists and researchers working at the Institute, and he creates a medieval cloister, just the way monks in a monastery would gather around the cloistered courtyard and come out of their individual cells that were centered around this courtyard. He does the same thing here, but not with flying buttresses, but with modern architecture. But he creates this beautiful inner court in which all of the offices for the researchers and scientists all look down onto this courtyard, and then they all get a view down the courtyard out towards the Pacific Ocean. And it's meant to be inspiring and beautiful, and to give scientists something to, you know, some natural beauty and something to inspire them. You know, scientists and researchers maybe have a tendency to you know, be hermits in their laboratory and, you know, and never see the light of day. And this was an opportunity to say, hey, they need to have something in their lives to inspire them. And he uses the architecture and the planning here to try to make them better scientists. In plan, you see on the left is the sort of cliffside and the view out towards the Pacific Ocean. On the right is the parking lot and so forth. And here, right in the middle, is where we see that courtyard. The last view was standing right about here, looking to the left. And so because they are scientists and they have laboratories, all that, you know, isn't going to have views and so forth. They just need sort of boxes for the laboratory. So you see these two huge boxes on either side, the top and the bottom here. Those are pretty simple for the laboratories. But these little pods that stick out into the courtyard, those are the office pods for the scientists. And so this has almost a quadrangle academic campus feel, and definitely comes right out of the inspiration that Thomas Jefferson had for the University of Virginia. We talked about that earlier on, and having both this central quadrangle where people can meet together, but the individual buildings for the different schools that made up the university. In the same way, Kahn uses that here at the Salk Institute. In section, we see the main part of it is the research laboratory building. And there's a lot of technical innovations in here, huge interstitial, this space here and this space here. These are big interstitial floor spaces to allow plenty of ducting and mechanical systems for, you know, conducting all the various experiments and getting fresh air and stuff like that for the things they do in the laboratories, which are on these levels here and here. But then there is a sort of common circulation space and then a link to the pods that stick out into the courtyard. And these are the spaces where the scientists and researchers have their offices and so forth. So here's a view of another view of the courtyard, and you see that direct link in planning from the University of Virginia here, even though the architectural expression is so different. And you also see that the view to the ocean is to the left, almost behind the photographer. And so you see how these pods are designed with these angled walls in solid concrete, but then they open up to the windows that have beautiful views right out towards the ocean. We also see lots of concrete here, but also lots of natural woodwork, and this is something that, you know, Aalto had been doing, and several other regional and expressionist modern architects began introducing wood. And this is like Aalto, this is just untreated wood, and over time it weathers and grays, and it's used as a very natural material. We're not sort of altering its characteristics by painting it and carving it. It's just cut into dimensional shapes and applied as a veneer and then allowed to weather naturally and to obtain a natural patina. And you can also see the an incredible board form concrete. Here's a detail of the concrete. And this is, I've talked about this before, when you have buildings without ornamentation and without a lot of detailing on them, every little detail becomes critical. And so those who worked in concrete would be very specific about how they wanted the forms and the imprint that the forms make on the finished surface of the concrete, how they wanted that to look. And so Kahn and the others would be very specific about the pin that would tie the forms together when the wet concrete is poured in. They have to be held together or they would just blow apart all that wet concrete. And so when they remove the pins, you wind up with like a little hole in the surface of the concrete. Well, you can put those in specific patterns to create a certain almost decoration on the surface of the concrete. And then also you can see the edges of the different forms, or you could put a little line in there to create patterns in the concrete slabs itself. And these are all the kinds of nitty-gritty details that a good modernist architect gets involved with because they know that this is what we're seeing. And the last photo is of the interior of one of the office spaces here. So we see, again, a lot of raw exposed concrete on the interior. The same material that's on the outside is being used on the inside. That's a common use of modern, or common expression of modern architecture. And then, more natural woodwork on the inside. You can see some of the views and windows that look out into the courtyard and out towards the ocean. So another great work of Louis Kahn is the Kimball Art Museum. This is in Fort Worth, Texas, from '66, finished in 1972. And here he is inspired by the barrel vaulted arches and basilicas of ancient Rome. Again, he's not going to create the Basilica of Constantine with Corinthian capitals and so forth. But this form and the structural form he feels will work really well for an art museum. It's a nice structural system, but it also can be grouped together, as you see in this model, to create larger spaces that can open up to each other. And we'll also see that the vault itself can be manipulated to allow better natural light to come in. So here is an early design sketch, a section through 3 of the vaults that he did. And you can see the barrel vaulting here with, in some cases, solid walls, but then with openings in between those vaults. And then at the top, and he doesn't detail it yet, but I'll show you a detail, he's going to open the top of the vault up to allow natural light to come in and give some soft illumination of the galleries inside. Here's an exterior view, and you can repeat the vaulting as many times as you need to create the size and volume of the museum. And then one vault here on the end is just left open to create essentially like a porch or an outdoor covered area where visitors can sit outside and enjoy a nice Texas day. And so here again is one of the portico vaults where you come in and you're sheltered, and then you can gather yourself and go on into the interior. So here's a more refined section detail of the vaulting, almost exactly what we just saw in the design sketch, but in a finished form. And so at the top of the vault right here, you can see he puts in a skylight band, and then on the inside he has reflectors, because in an art gallery you don't want sunlight to just come beaming in. That creates too much light and shadowing and stuff, and you don't want that in an art gallery, both for the protection of the artwork but also just to be able to see it well. But you do need good soft diffuse light, and so these reflectors take that outdoor sunlight and it washes them down the walls in a soft manner and limits the UV penetration that can damage the artwork. And so we see how that works in the actual gallery itself. So you look up, you see this sort of curved, counter-curved form here in the middle. This also creates a light stanchion for artificial lighting, but during the daytime, natural light is washed down the vaults here and can wash down onto the walls along the side or just into the general space. And you can see how the galleries in between vaulted sections can be opened up or closed off with these sliding panels. And this is a very universal type space that Mies van der Rohe described, in which you can move the panels around to create different gallery spaces depending on the exhibition that is being put on at the gallery. One last photo showing a completely different layout where you have the panels, you know, in sections going down. One of them is even turned 90 degrees, and you can create almost an enclosure of this gallery, but still with spaces in between to be able to move into the gallery adjacent. The last project is a little more of an example of regional modernism. This is the National Assembly in Dhaka, Bangladesh, started in 1962. It's built in stages, finished in 1982. And so here again, we see a continuation of his use of concrete and masonry, but he applies some characteristics that are unique to Bangladesh and that represent the culture and the landscape of Bangladesh to tie it better to its site. And this is a good example of regional modernism. This is the Assembly Hall building itself, which is made out of concrete. There's a aerial view, and there's a number of brick masonry buildings that are supportive to the assembly all around it. But you can notice it's almost like an island in this lake or whatever. And this is important because water is everywhere in Bangladesh. They more or less live in a swamp there, and so by tying their assembly building into with water and integrating it with water, he is directly connecting their culture and society and the architecture with their site and their landscape. He's really using bold geometries here. This is starting to break into almost postmodern architecture, and we'll be talking about postmodernism very shortly here. And that emerges in the 1970s. So we're seeing some of that influence with these strong geometric shapes and circles and triangles and half circles. We're going to see that with like Robert Venturi very shortly. And again, the brick masonry, some of these smaller buildings are brick masonry, and then you can see the main assembly hall in concrete. And this is a view, you get a lot of fog and stuff in this country, and so the building is meant to sort of anchor itself with the water and the trees all around it to the landscape of Bangladesh. Here's a model of it. This is the Assembly Hall building. And this, again, is sort of inspired by these massive vaulted assembly spaces of ancient Rome. But here using actually, it's not even, I think it is an octagon, right? But with the main assembly building down in here and these massive concrete, cast concrete forms up above to create visual interest, but also some structural support. And lots of different forms and shapes on the inside. Like I say, this is really moving more towards a postmodernism of architecture that we'll be talking about. There's another view in one of the lobby spaces. So we also had discussed Le Corbusier and his work in the international style from the 1920s into the 1930s. And I even, in some of the examples I gave, I talked a little bit about how he could be, he was an artist and he could be very sculptural in different parts of his buildings. But starting in the post-war era, he sort of, like some of these others, broke out of the more geometric, restrained modernism and into more an expressionist modernism using concrete. Le Corbusier had always been an early practitioner in concrete. So here he is again And the best example of that is Notre Dame de Haute, or better known just commonly as Orange-Champ, because it's in Orange-Champ, France. This is from 1951 to 55, and it is a small chapel for an order, I think it's an order of nuns, and it's in a very remote site, and it is just meant to be an expression of faith for these nuns that would come here, to worship. And now it's a place where architectural tourists come to almost worship at the feet of a Caboose EI. And I have to admit, although I'm not a big fan of Caboose EI in general, this is a really cool building. I got to see this when I was in college, and I was pretty blown away by it. But immediately we can see that it's taking the idea of a spire reaching towards the heavens, pointing towards the heavens, but not just sticking it on like Christopher Wren Church in London, but making the form of the architecture, point upwards, and in using the concrete. Some of this is concrete, some of it is stucco, frame with stucco, but it all looks like monolithic concrete, but coming up to this point here. So he doesn't add a spire, he makes the architecture a spire in itself. Off to the side looks more like a bell tower, more very traditional. And then the wall here is not a huge glazed wall of art glass, but as we'll see, has these penetrations of smaller pieces of art glass to create almost an art installation on the interior. Here's a different view of it, and you can see the way this building, just slides and swoops and then points towards the sky, towards the heaven. And also, this is a good moment. You can see how the roof floats independently above the walls of the building. And this is also, breaking the pieces of architecture apart into its components and separating them. It's almost like these chefs. There was a big trend for a while with chefs to deconstruct a meal, and they take a taco, and instead of putting everything into one shell, you have it little pieces on your plate, and I guess you're just supposed to put them all together in your mouth. But this is almost the way, that sort of same idea in architecture, where you have the different components almost separated physically from each other. In section, we can see how that roof is actually constructed, and how it literally floats above the exterior walls. You can see there's just one little pinpoint here to connect the walls and the roof. And he doesn't use solid concrete. There's a lot of hollow shells here, and that helps reduce the cost and the weight and all of that. But look how the walls here are battered. They're canted and angled on both the inside and the outside. And then the openings are also angled in different shapes and forms. So, again, they're not just taking a straight, vertical board form and pouring it with concrete. We're creating different forms and shapes using the materials for that. On the inside, we can see here at the very top, there's actually here's the pinpoint connecting the roof and the wall here and here. The rest of it is just a little strip that allows a little bit of light in. And we see little holes here on this wall letting in little bits of light, and then more of the openings on the right side letting in even more light. And light, as we talked with Baroque architecture, especially light in a church is an important element, and architects have been working for centuries trying to make dramatic lighting to inspire the faithful. And I think Abu pulls it off pretty well here, especially when you look at the wall. So, like I said, this isn't one big sheet of window with art glass in it. The wall itself becomes a sculptural work of colored light art, and it's fantastic. You can't really reproduce it that well in a photograph. You really have to experience it. And just one more view of that, but we'll kind of move on since we're low on time. Another example that is both expressionist and more regional is Chandigarh in Punjab, India, from the 1950s by Caboose EA. And this is a brand new city. India is growing in the post-war period. They're, had achieved their independence from Britain, and we're looking to build, an infrastructure of capital cities and so forth, regional capital cities. And so this is the capital. Chandigarh is the capital city of Punjab. And so there's a number of buildings. There's an assembly building, there's a court building, and public spaces and so forth. And so here's an example of an architect being able to essentially design a whole brand new city, which doesn't happen very often. So again, we can see a little bit of the more traditional Caboosian international style of architecture, concrete building with grid window system, but on the end is a much more expressive form here with this upside down curved concrete form that helps to sort of direct the eye up towards the sky and create this dramatic monumental entry focal point, in the way maybe a dome on a Capitol building might do the same thing. Here's one of the public plazas with an art installation. And this is another aerial backside view of the legislative building. So we had just seen that sort of curved portico form over here on the right, and then we see better now on the top of the roof is this huge shape that sits over top of the assembly hall itself. And so there's probably a skylight in there, and the form of the exterior sort of expresses the idea of this assembly space on the inside. Another view. This is the High Court building. We see some of the bright colors that Caboose was famous for and continued to use throughout his career. And again, we see the grid of windows here that's almost like a screen. In India, where the weather is quite hot and humid pretty much all the time, they have a lot of sort of screen-like fenestration, and so he's using the concrete form here to reflect that. So it's a way of regional architecture to tie the architecture into what was traditional in the region. But he's also expressive with this form of concrete sort of emerging out of the roof up here at the very top. Here's one of the market buildings, commercial market buildings, and again, he's got this sort of open screen work here at the top. You see that is evocative of the traditional architecture that is often found in India. So another regional and expressive modernist is Oscar Niemeyer. Niemeyer is a Brazilian architect, and he was very much influenced by Caboose EI, and especially worked in concrete quite a bit, and really absorbed that expressionist mode of concrete use that Caboose EI had done, that we just saw some examples of. And he gets to plan a city as well, which is, like I say, a very rare thing. In the 1960s, Brazil plans a brand new capital city called Brasilia, and they hire Niemeyer to do the planning and design a number of buildings for it. And the quote at the bottom here is a great quote that sort of explains Niemeyer's view of what expressionist architecture ought to be. That, hard straight lines are an unnatural thing, and that he believes in free-flowing sensual curves that you find in mountains and rivers and women and so forth, and he's inspired by all of those things to create an architecture that feels more natural and more a part of the environment than straight lines would be. Not that he's completely objects to straight lines altogether. We can see a large open, what we might call the mall or plaza here out front, on which the other buildings are focused around. At the very far end is the assembly, the National Assembly building. Here's a close-up view of that, and we see a very expressionist form. We've got a dome on one side, we've got a what you might call a reverse dome, almost like a saucer plate or bowl on the other side, and these towers in between that act as a strong visual draw that in the way that a tall Capitol dome might do. On the inside, we have, on one of those dome spaces, the open curved stair and the sort of plain concrete walls on the interior. This is a view of the National Cathedral, also by Niemeyer. He didn't do all the buildings in the Capitol complex, but he did quite a few of the most important ones. And so this is another building that's very expressive. It's swooping and flowing towards a point that then splays out towards the heavens. And it's a way of expressing the idea of, man, anchored on the ground, being lifted up into the heavens. And using cast concrete in these arced curved forms as the structural system, and then everything in between can be glass. And he uses a modern form of art glass, the way a Gothic cathedral might have, but in a very modern way, showing the blues and the greens that all represent, essentially like the rivers, like the Amazon of Brazil and the jungle and so forth. He's tying that all into this national cathedral. So it anchors the building in a subtle but direct way to the idea that this belongs in Brazil because of its landscape. This is the Foreign Relations building, also by Niemeyer. This is a more or less Miesian international style box, but then he creates this wide portico all the way around it with these very expressive columns that tie in the porch deck and the huge roof deck slab. Not Miesian at all. And so it's an interesting combination of the two types of modern architecture in one here, and then it's surrounded by this moat of water, which again is something that is very special and common in Brazil. Here's another view of that more dramatically at night. Another example is his National Museum. This is just far out there. I think this is almost space age, which is an influence by this time. We're in the heart or the heat of the space race between America and the Soviet Union, and this looks like it could be built on Mars. And we have this concrete domed structure with these sloping, swooping balconies and ramps and so forth that all swoop out, and the whole thing is surrounded by this moat of water. And I have a few views that show that this is, like I say, right out of some 1960s era sci-fi Martian invasion movie. On the interior, the main domed space is this just grandiose space. You see the underside of the concrete dome and another swooping, curving ramp system that leads you up to a mezzanine level. And then much of the museum is sort of in galleries around the perimeter. And this is more of just a reception hall here in the center. There's another view from the mezzanine up above. Okay, and a few other examples. One would be Jorn Utzon. Utzon is a Danish architect, and his most famous work was from 1957. He wins a competition to design a new opera house in Sydney, Australia. And this might be one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. You show someone this, even a kid or a novice, member of the public, and they're going to recognize it. They may not exactly know where it is and who designed it and all that, but it's something that they've seen before, and it especially became popular when Sydney hosted the Olympics a couple decades ago. And this is very expressive, and it's showing exactly really what this building is. It's a series of galleries and performance halls, each with this vaulted roof form that is creating the space below it. But it's also expressive, and it's rooted to its site as a form of regional modernism because it's right on the harbor. See, I think in the next photo you see it almost better. It's right on the harbor, and it looks like sails of all the sailboats and ships and so forth that would have all, long plied the harbor. Nowadays, sailing ships are just pleasure craft, but anyone in Sydney would look out in their harbor and always see these sails, and now they see it in their most iconic piece of architecture. Here's another view. You can see those concrete vaults swooping up and out like the way a sail might, and a little bit of glass to let in light into the different concert halls. Here's an example of one of the concert halls here. Utzon also designed the National Assembly building in Kuwait in the Middle East, so a completely different kind of landscape, no water here. And he used concrete again, but he creates a vision of tall stanchions with these swooping, almost fabric-like forms in between. And this is evocative of Middle Eastern architecture on the Arabian Peninsula, in which they used, traditionally used tents a lot. And this is in concrete, it's not fabric, but the swooping forms in here almost look like they're certainly definitely inspired by the sort of sagging fabric tent forms that would be held up by these vertical stanchions. So this again is a combination of expressionist modernism, but also a regional modernism, something that is tied directly to the culture or the climate that creates this entry portico for the assembly hall. And I think this view right here really expresses this is underneath it, and you can see the complexity of the forms, and you can easily imagine the ceiling being, fabric tent forms rather than concrete. And the last example I want to talk about is in Japan, Kenzo Tange. Tange is probably the most influential Japanese architect to emerge in the post-war period and would have a direct influence on many of the other more recent Japanese architects. And he also works initially in a modernist genre, sort of Miesian, Bauhaus international style, but he also moves and transitions both to an expressionist form of architecture in some of his work, but also really ties many of his buildings to the materials and to the culture of Japan. And we see that really well in his own house, where he can do whatever he wants. This is very much a Japanese style home. This looks like it belongs in Japan. We see almost literal interpretations of soji screen walls. We see a lot of woodwork, wood craft, wood construction was very important in traditional Japanese architecture, but he blends that with cast concrete, which is a new modern material that was completely alien to Japanese before the 20th century. And it even has a Japanese style roof, a little hard to tell here, but we see the tiles on the roof, and in the next photo, we see the underside of the wood framing of it. It's not the over elaborate Daogong style of roof framing that the Chinese and the Japanese were famous for, but it shows the craftsmanship and the traditional timber construction work of Japanese architecture, but in a very modern expression and use. His Peace Museum in Hiroshima from 1949 is probably the most Caboozian of his work. It's set on pilotis, so it's raised up off the ground like Caboo, one of his 5 points. The exterior doesn't have the ribbon windows that Caboo had promoted, but it definitely has that sort of free form exterior and the flat roof that Caboo had talked about. But the exterior walls are a series of almost louvered panels, vertical louvers that help protect the interior from, direct sunlight that comes in. And this is a museum dedicated to peace, because Hiroshima is where the first atomic bomb was dropped by the Americans to end World War II. But his National Gymnasium in Tokyo from 1964 is very expressionist. This is an architecture that looks like it is some kind of assembly space. We have this swooping roof form, and underneath is an open, column-free vaulted space, and he's using, innovative structural vaulting techniques of modern that you can use with modern concrete to create that open space on the interior, and it's a very swooping form. And this form here is also kind